The night air was thick with tension as Margaret Sinclair pored over the endless stream of intercepted messages. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated her tired face, shadows cast by the stacks of papers and the hum of typewriters filling the quiet room. Every coded word she deciphered felt like a lifeline, a thread connecting the lives of soldiers on the front to the safety of distant command rooms. But tonight, there was a nagging unease in her mind, a subtle inconsistency that refused to be ignored. One convoy report did not match the patterns. One location did not align with previous intelligence. It was a tiny anomaly, barely perceptible, but Margaret knew better than to dismiss it. Across the channel, Colonel Henry Wallace's office was a whirlwind of activity. Maps were strewn across tables, phones rang incessantly, and aides rushed in with updated reports. He had trusted the intelligence coming in from London for weeks, allowing strategic decisions to follow its guidance without question. Now, the first hints of disaster were emerging. Troops had reported unexpected enemy resistance, supply lines were delayed, and units were dangerously exposed. Wallace felt the weight of every life in his hands, the gnawing certainty that a single error could spiral into catastrophe. He summoned Margaret, urgency in his voice, and for hours they worked together, retracing every intercepted message, every cipher, every assumption. At the front, soldiers were moving cautiously, unaware that the plans they followed were flawed. Lieutenant James Carter led his platoon through dense woods, relying on coordinates from headquarters that now seemed unreliable. He noticed the silence of the forest, the absence of expected patrols, and a growing sense of unease settled over him. A miscalculation could mean walking into a trap, but for now, he followed orders, trusting that the invisible hands guiding him knew more than he did. In the chaos of war, trust in intelligence was as critical as trust in a fellow soldier. Margaret's eyes were raw from hours of concentration when she finally saw it. The misread cipher, the single incorrect digit that had shifted the enemy's position entirely. Her heart pounded as she realized the full implications. If this error had not been caught, an entire battalion could have been ambushed, hundreds of lives lost, and momentum on a key front jeopardized. She quickly compiled the corrected intelligence, her fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard, aware that every second counted. Once the updated information was transmitted, she allowed herself a breath she hadn't dared take in hours, knowing that her vigilance had prevented a disaster. Meanwhile, at the front line, the ripple effect of the corrected intelligence was immediate. Units altered their movements, avoiding the ambush that had been set by enemy forces. Supply convoys reached their destinations on time, reinforcements arrived where needed, and soldiers who had walked blind into danger now moved with careful precision. Lieutenant Carter, unaware of the silent drama that had just unfolded in London, led his men safely through the forest, thinking only of the terrain, the enemy, and the mission. Lives were saved, battles were won, and all because of work done in silence, far from the roar of guns and the chaos of combat. Even as the immediate crisis passed, the weight of what could have happened hung over Margaret, Colonel Wallace, and every analyst in the room. They had glimpsed the fine line between victory and disaster, the fragile thread on which entire campaigns rested. In the quiet aftermath, Margaret allowed herself a small, private moment of pride, understanding that heroism did not always require medals or recognition. It could be found in vigilance, in meticulous work, in the courage to insist on the truth when no one else saw it. The war moved forward, but the lesson remained etched in the minds of those who had lived it. Even a small mistake in intelligence could have catastrophic consequences, and the invisible hands of those who gathered, decoded, and corrected information were as vital to survival as the soldiers fighting on the front lines. Margaret, Colonel Wallace, and the countless unseen analysts had averted disaster that night, proving that courage and skill often worked quietly in the shadows, shaping the course of history in ways the world would never fully see. Dawn broke over the forested hills, pale sunlight filtering through mist and smoke. Lieutenant James Carter's platoon moved cautiously, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning every shadow. The men were tense, each step a test of nerves, but the earlier missteps in intelligence had been corrected, and the path before them was now safer, though danger still lurked in every corner. Carter felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. Every decision could mean life or death, and yet he had no idea how close they had come to disaster the night before. Back at the Allied Command Center, Colonel Wallace studied the maps with grim focus. The corrected intelligence had shifted the entire operational plan, and he knew the margin for error was razor-thin. Reinforcements had been rerouted, supply lines adjusted, and defensive positions recalibrated. The Army had narrowly avoided catastrophe, but the incident had exposed the vulnerability inherent in relying on complex, fragile streams of information. Wallace made a mental note to double-check every report, every cipher, every assumption, a lesson painfully learned. Margaret worked alongside her team, still exhausted from the long hours, yet her mind was sharper than ever. They pored over every incoming message, cross-referencing, validating, and rechecking every detail. The sense of urgency was relentless. One small oversight could undo everything they had saved. She glanced at a photograph of her younger brother, stationed on the front, and felt a pang of fear that reminded her why her work mattered. These were not abstract numbers or codes. They were lives, real and fragile, hanging in the balance. In the forest, the platoon pressed on. Carter's men were wary but disciplined, moving in tight formation as they approached the ridge where the enemy was expected to appear. Reports had been updated, positions recalculated, and yet the tension was palpable. Every rustle of leaves, every distant crack of gunfire made hearts pound faster. Soldiers whispered in low tones, recalling rumors of the ambush that had almost befall them. Even as they advanced cautiously, the knowledge that an error had nearly cost them their lives lingered in the back of their minds. Then the moment of truth arrived. Enemy scouts emerged from the tree line, moving in formations that could have spelled disaster the previous day. But thanks to Margaret's correction and Wallace's swift recalculations, the platoon was prepared. Defensive positions were already fortified. Flanking units had been rerouted, and reinforcements were on call. The enemy advance was met with organized resistance rather than chaos. Men moved with precision, and what could have been a massacre turned into a contained skirmish, forcing the attackers to retreat. Lives were saved, and the momentum of the campaign was preserved. As the sun climbed higher, Carter paused to look over the ridge, the battlefield momentarily quiet. He could not see Margaret, Colonel Wallace, or the analysts who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Yet their presence was palpable in every decision he made, every maneuver executed, and every life preserved. The invisible network of intelligence, vigilance, and courage had tipped the scales, turning a near disaster into a decisive advantage. In the command center, Wallace allowed himself a rare moment of relief. The crisis had been averted, but the lesson was seared into his memory. The war was fought not only with weapons and men, but with information, accuracy, and the unrelenting diligence of those who remained unseen. Margaret sat beside him, exhausted yet resolute, knowing that her careful attention had made the difference between survival and catastrophe. The war would go on, but tonight's events would serve as a stark reminder of how fragile victory truly was. Even in the aftermath, the human cost lingered. Soldiers tended minor wounds, exhausted men huddled for rest, and whispers of near disaster circulated quietly. None of them fully grasped how close they had come to being overwhelmed, but the gratitude ran deep for the invisible hands that had guided them through danger. It was a silent, powerful bond between those on the front lines and those who had fought a different, equally crucial battle in the shadows of strategy rooms and code-breaking halls. The following night, The battlefield was quiet, but tension simmered beneath the surface. Lieutenant Carter's platoon had secured their positions along the ridge, but scouts reported unusual enemy movements. Even with the corrected intelligence, no one could fully predict the enemy's next maneuver. Soldiers huddled by campfires, rifles close, sharing whispered stories of narrow escapes and the mistakes that had nearly cost them everything. Each man understood, without needing to say it, that their survival owed more to unseen minds than to their own courage alone. Back in London, Margaret worked late into the night, her eyes scanning every new message with relentless intensity. She cross-checked coordinates, troop movements, and supply routes, each piece of information a potential lifeline for those on the front. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her, but also a sense of purpose, stronger than fatigue. One small error here, one misread cipher there, and the lives of hundreds, perhaps thousands, would hang in the balance. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, transmitting corrected intelligence to the field just as new enemy movements were detected. Colonel Wallace paced the command center, phone pressed to his ear, issuing orders that relied entirely on the accuracy of Margaret's work. Every decision was a gamble, every message a lifeline. Units were repositioned, reinforcements redirected, and defensive perimeters reinforced. What had begun as a quiet, almost invisible crisis was now a coordinated effort to prevent disaster. Soldiers on the front had no idea how close they had come to walking into an ambush, how nearly they had been cut off and overwhelmed. The invisible war within the war was now reaching its most critical stage. At dawn, the ridge erupted in chaos as enemy forces advanced unexpectedly fast. Carter's platoon moved with precision, guided by the corrected intelligence. Every maneuver, every defensive position, every flanking unit had been planned according to Margaret's careful corrections. What could have been a slaughter instead became a strategic advantage. The enemy was forced into exposed positions, their movements anticipated, their lines fragmented. Explosions echoed across the hills, but the platoon held its ground, repelling attack after attack with minimal losses. In the command center, Wallace monitored the battle's progress, his heart pounding as reports came in. Units that had been misdirected the previous day were now safely maneuvering into positions of strength. Margaret's corrections had turned the tide, preventing the enemy from exploiting the earlier intelligence error. Every successful maneuver, every soldier who survived, was a testament to the unseen effort of those who had worked tirelessly behind the scenes. They were the hidden guardians of life and strategy, ensuring that a single mistake did not become a catastrophe. Hours later, the battle was won. Carter's platoon held the ridge, the enemy retreating in disarray. Soldiers breathed heavily, bloodied but alive. And though they did not see Margaret or Wallace, their lives owed everything to the vigilance of those in shadowed offices and code rooms. Margaret allowed herself a rare smile, the exhaustion momentarily forgotten, as she realized that the tiny anomaly she had detected had been corrected just in time to save countless lives. The mistake had almost cost the war, but human skill, perseverance, and courage had averted disaster. Even in victory, the memory of the error lingered. Wallace knew that the margin between success and catastrophe had been razor-thin. The soldiers, unaware of how close they had come to disaster, would carry on with their duties, but the command staff would never forget. The war was a delicate tapestry, woven from intelligence, courage, and split-second decisions, and one small tear could have unraveled it all. Tonight, that tear had been mended, and the lives saved would be forever owed to those who had worked unseen, unrecognized, yet irreplaceably vital. The battlefield had quieted, but the echoes of what could have been lingered in every mind. Lieutenant Carter sat against a tree, rifle resting across his knees, watching the sun rise over the ridge he and his men had fought so desperately to hold. Sweat and dirt streaked his face, and the weight of the night's events pressed on him. He thought of the ambush that had been narrowly avoided, of the lives that had been spared, and an unspoken gratitude settled over him for the invisible hands that had guided their every move. He had faced death and danger countless times, but this near disaster caused by a single intelligence error had reminded him just how fragile their survival truly was. Back in London, Margaret leaned back in her chair, exhausted yet restless. She allowed herself a long exhale, fingers stained with ink and her eyes heavy from hours of decoding and cross-checking. She thought of the platoon on the ridge, of the men who would wake to see another day because of her diligence. It was a strange kind of victory, silent, uncelebrated, invisible, but no less vital. Her mind replayed every step, every correction, every moment where a split-second decision had prevented catastrophe. For her, the war was no longer just battles and front lines. It was vigilance, precision, and the unglamorous courage of those who worked in shadows. Colonel Wallace walked through the empty command center, maps rolled up and phones silent for the first time in days. The near disaster had shaken him more than he expected. He had known the value of intelligence, had trusted it implicitly, yet this mistake had exposed the thin line between victory and tragedy. He glanced at a photograph of his men, soldiers whose lives had been spared, and realized that their survival rested not only on strategy, but on human skill, attention, and perseverance. History might never know the story of the corrected intelligence, but for those whose lives hung in the balance, the consequences were indelible. In the small moments that followed, soldiers cleaned weapons, patched wounds, and whispered quietly about the night that had almost undone them. Carter's platoon shared stories in low tones, neither boasting nor condemning, simply acknowledging the fragile margin that had kept them alive. They did not see Margaret, Wallace, or the thousands of analysts and codebreakers working tirelessly behind the scenes, yet the truth of their protection was palpable in every order executed, every position held, every life spared. They had been guided by invisible hands, steered through danger by minds and hearts unseen. Margaret thought of the countless others like her, the women and men who labored in offices, code rooms, and factories, whose work never appeared on headlines or in history books. They were the quiet guardians of victory, the invisible lifeline connecting the front lines to the safety of command and the hope of survival. One small mistake had nearly cost the war, yet the diligence, skill, and courage of those unseen had corrected it in time. Their legacy was not in medals or parades, but in lives saved, missions accomplished, and battles preserved. As evening fell, a calm settled over the ridge and the command centers alike. Soldiers rested, analysts closed their files, and the war continued, relentless and unforgiving, yet slightly safer for the courage and vigilance of a few unseen individuals. The lesson lingered. In a conflict defined by precision, every detail mattered. Every observation, every correction, every moment of diligence could ripple outward with consequences measured in life and death. Margaret, Wallace, Carter, and the countless invisible hands had proved that even the smallest acts of attentiveness could alter the fate of nations. And so, in the quiet aftermath of near catastrophe, there was a strange serenity. The war would rage on, but for one night, disaster had been averted. Lives were preserved, strategy realigned, and the fragile thread of intelligence had held firm. The human cost of vigilance, the uncelebrated courage of the unseen, and the enduring power of attention to detail had ensured that one mistake did not become a tragedy. History might overlook their names, but the consequences of their actions would endure forever, etched into the lives they saved and the battles they had quietly won. The sun rose over the battlefield, casting long shadows across the ridge and valleys below. Lieutenant Carter watched the horizon, his platoon regrouping after a night that had tested them beyond measure. Every soldier carried the exhaustion of hours spent in tense vigilance, yet also a quiet relief. They had survived, avoided a trap that could have decimated their ranks, and held the line. Few would ever know how close they had come to disaster, but each life preserved bore silent testament to the unseen forces that had guided them. Far from the front lines, Margaret Sinclair finally allowed herself a moment of stillness. Her hands, stiff and ink-stained from decoding hundreds of messages, rested in her lap. She thought of the soldiers on the ridge, the men she would never meet personally, but whose survival depended on her precision and vigilance. The weight of responsibility pressed on her even now, yet beneath it was a quiet pride. One small mistake had nearly cost lives, but her attention to detail, her refusal to dismiss the anomaly, had corrected the course of history in real time. She understood that heroism often went unseen, but its impact was undeniable. Colonel Wallace moved through the now quiet command center, the tension that had gripped him for days finally easing. He studied the maps one last time, noting the shifts in troop movements and enemy positions. The corrected intelligence had saved hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. Entire campaigns could have been jeopardized by a single misread cipher. Yet, through human skill, diligence, and courage, disaster had been averted. Wallace realized that battles were not always won by guns alone. Sometimes they were won by the minds and hearts of those working tirelessly in the shadows. In the forest beyond the ridge, Carter's platoon tended to minor injuries and checked their positions. Soldiers exchanged quiet words, each aware of the invisible thread that had kept them alive. They did not see Margaret, Wallace, or the analysts who had worked behind the lines, but every maneuver, every calculated decision, every correction had come from their unseen efforts. The connection between front and back, battlefield and command center, was fragile yet vital. It was a reminder that in war, not all victories were visible, but all had consequences. Even as the soldiers moved forward, the echoes of the near disaster remained. Margaret returned to her decoding desk, already preparing for the next wave of messages, knowing that vigilance could never waver. Wallace reviewed reports, aware that a single lapse in attention could be catastrophic. Carter and his men marched on, unaware that the invisible hands guiding them had prevented calamity, their lives and the success of their mission resting in the careful work of those they would never meet. The war would continue, fierce and unyielding, yet one night had shown how delicate the balance truly was. A mistake in intelligence had almost tipped the scales toward disaster, but human skill, courage, and relentless attention to detail had preserved lives, strategies, and hope. The soldiers, the analysts, the code breakers, and the commanders were all bound together by this unseen effort, a silent network whose impact would never fully appear in history books. And so, the story of that night remained largely invisible to the world, a hidden testament to the quiet heroism that shapes wars and preserves lives. Margaret Sinclair, Colonel Wallace, Lieutenant Carter, and countless others had demonstrated that courage does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers through meticulous attention, unyielding resolve, and the quiet refusal to let a mistake go unchecked. In that quiet, unseen vigilance, they had changed the course of history, proving that even in the shadows, human determination could avert disaster and shape the fate of nations. The ridge, now bathed in sunlight, stood as a silent monument. The men moved forward, alive, victorious in ways they could never fully comprehend. Behind them, in offices, code rooms, and strategy halls, others carried on their unseen work, ready to correct the next mistake, prevent the next disaster, and ensure that even when the world did not know their names, their courage and skill would continue to protect and preserve life. The war was not only fought with weapons, but with vigilance, intellect, and quiet heroism, and that night had proven its immeasurable power. Weeks passed, and the war pressed on, relentless and unforgiving. Yet for Margaret, Wallace, and Carter, the memory of that near disaster remained vivid, a quiet reminder of how fragile success could be. Margaret often lingered at her desk long after the office had emptied, reviewing messages, cross-checking codes, and thinking of the soldiers whose lives had been saved by her vigilance. Each cipher she decoded carried with it the weight of responsibility, a lifeline connecting the front lines to safety and survival. She knew that one missed detail could change everything, and she carried that lesson with her every day. Colonel Wallace, now overseeing broader operations, moved with a heightened awareness of the stakes involved. Every report, every movement, every decision was filtered through the memory of that night when a single misread message had almost cost lives. He spoke often to his officers about diligence, about the importance of checking and rechecking, about humility before the complexity of war. In quiet moments, he would reflect on the invisible army of analysts, codebreakers, and clerks who ensured that errors were corrected before they became disasters. Victory, he understood, depended as much on unseen minds as on armed forces. Lieutenant Carter and his platoon continued their mission, unaware of the narrow margin that had saved them. Yet even they felt the weight of the unseen hand that guided them. They spoke quietly of the events of that night, sharing the tension and relief, realizing that not every victory was visible, but every life mattered. Each soldier knew that their survival was tied to decisions made far from the battlefield, and it deepened their respect for the invisible efforts that shaped every campaign. In the months that followed, historians would write of battles won and lost, of strategies executed and enemy lines broken. Few would note the code breakers in dimly lit rooms, the analysts poring over cryptic messages, or the officers who caught errors before they became disasters. Yet the ripple effects of their work were undeniable. Entire missions had been preserved, countless soldiers kept from harm, and the momentum of campaigns maintained. The war had been fought on many fronts, and some of the most critical battles had been won in silence, through vigilance, intellect, and quiet courage. Margaret, reflecting on her role, realized that heroism often does not wear a uniform or carry a medal. It lives in the meticulous attention to detail, in the refusal to overlook a single anomaly, and in the courage to speak up when the world does not yet understand the stakes. She had learned that even small acts, performed under pressure and without recognition, could ripple outward to change the course of history. The war had nearly been lost to a tiny mistake, but human skill, determination, and perseverance had corrected the course in time. As Carter's platoon moved to their next assignment, as Wallace planned future campaigns, and as Margaret prepared for the next night of decoding, the lesson endured. Vigilance saves lives. Errors could almost cost wars, but the courage to notice, correct, and act ensured that history did not falter. The ridge, the offices, the code rooms, all were connected by invisible threads of determination and resilience, and together they had altered the fate of nations. And in the quiet, uncelebrated moments, they understood that history is shaped not only by battles seen, but by battles fought in shadowed rooms, by minds working tirelessly behind the scenes, and by the unwavering human spirit that refuses to let a mistake become a catastrophe. That night, and the countless nights like it, proved that even the smallest acts of diligence could carry the heaviest consequences, and that unseen courage often leaves the most lasting mark on the world. Years later, the war was over, and the world was slowly rebuilding. Cities bore the scars of conflict, families mourned what they had lost, and nations celebrated victories hard won. Yet, for those who had fought the silent battles, the memories remained vivid, etched into their hearts and minds. Margaret Sinclair sat in her quiet office, reviewing reports that now seemed mundane, but had once carried the weight of life and death. She thought of the soldiers on the ridge, of Lieutenant Carter and his men, and of every life that had been preserved because someone had noticed what others overlooked. A single error had almost cost them everything, but courage, vigilance, and determination had prevailed. Colonel Wallace walked along the streets of London, now filled with the bustle of peace rather than the tension of war. He reflected on the delicate balance that had saved lives that night, on the countless analysts and code breakers who labored unseen, and on the extraordinary power of diligence. Victory had been preserved not only by rifles and tanks, but by intellect, attention to detail, and the quiet courage of ordinary people doing extraordinary work. Lieutenant Carter, years removed from the ridge, remembered the tension, the fear, and the near catastrophe that had unfolded. He had never met Margaret in person, never thanked the countless unseen hands that had guided them through danger, yet he carried the lesson with him. Survival in war often depends as much on unseen vigilance as on bravery in battle. The men he had led lived because of intelligence corrected just in time, and he honored that silent heroism in every decision he made thereafter. The world moved on, rebuilding and forgetting many details of the war, yet the echoes of that night remained. Margaret, Wallace, Carter, and the countless unseen analysts had proven that even the smallest error could have devastating consequences, but also that careful attention, courage, and perseverance could avert disaster. Their work, largely invisible to history, had altered the fate of nations and saved countless lives. And so, history remembered the battles, the generals, and the soldiers on the front lines, but the invisible warriors, the code breakers, analysts, and planners remained largely unheralded. Yet their courage endured in the lives they had saved, the missions they had preserved, and the victories they had quietly secured. They had shown that heroism is not always loud, that victory is not always visible, and that even in the shadows, human determination can change the course of history. As the sun set over the rebuilt cities and quiet battlefields, the invisible threads of courage, vigilance, and skill that had preserved lives lingered, a silent monument to those who had shaped history without ever being seen. And though their names may never fill the pages of textbooks, their impact would endure forever. A reminder that even in war, the unseen, quiet acts of human determination often carry the heaviest weight.